We're going to welcome Alan Goodman back to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. Alan regularly reports on the RNL show and at revcom.us on the Mideast. And for the last 6 months, Alan has been covering the Israeli genocidal war backed by the U.S. on the people of Gaza. Alan, how you doing?
I'm angry. I'm here.
Good, good. Alan, we want to hear from you on the status of the beginning invasion of Rafah in Gaza as we film tonight, Wednesday evening. But first, for our viewers, I think it'd be very important if you could just briefly set the stage on where is Rafah and what's the situation in Rafah over the last few months.
So Rafah is I'm going to do my hand map like I did last week. Rafah is at the very southern tip of Gaza. Gaza itself, also called the Gaza Strip, because it's only 7 miles wide, 25 miles high, before Israel's retaliatory genocidal slaughter coming off October 7th, was one of the most packed places on earth. Now, half the population of Gaza has been driven by Israeli bombs, missiles, bulldozers, starvation, disease has been driven. This is half the population, over 1 million people, into the town of Rafah on the very southern tip of Gaza. And Rafah has a border crossing with Egypt and also into Israel to the east, Egypt to the south, Israel to the east. Packed into a town that had 250,000 people, where had they been living until today or until a few days ago, they had been living in tents, in desperate homemade tent cities, almost 1 million people, shoulder to shoulder in tents without access to enough food or water to sustain them, completely dependent, and keep track of this, completely dependent on daily aid trucks coming in through 2 different crossings, one from Egypt at the Rafah crossing, one from Israel at the Kerem Shalom crossing.
Alan, the news is filled with maneuvering over a possible ceasefire. Biden came out on Wednesday and said that he is pausing shipment of the biggest U.S. bombs to Israel. Yet at the same time, he said he would do this if Israel launches a full-scale invasion of Rafah. But the reality on the ground in Rafah is that Israel bombed the city earlier this week, unleashing horror on top of horror that the Palestinian people packed into Rafah are suffering from. So, Alan, what do we actually know about what has happened thus far in the military phase of what could be the opening of the Israeli assault on Rafah?
Well, first, I just think we need to say, without going into trying to make any analysis or speculation, that when word hit Rafah, these people in the most desperate situations, driven from their homes to another place, driven out of that other place, leaving everything, including their dead family members, behind, 10,000 of them buried in rubble. When news spread that Hamas had signed on to a ceasefire, people were dancing in the streets. The little bit of relief they would have gotten, and then that got yanked out from under them. So that's just sadistic. That's depraved. And then instead, what people have gotten is an exponential intensification of the nightmare. The city has been thrown into panic. Bombs are dropping, and I think you may be in a position to share with viewers a map of this. Bombs are dropping all over Rafah. Explosions. There's dust in the air. People are desperately trying to save victims. People are panicky. And then I mentioned that the people driven into Rafah are day to day, hour to hour dependent on the trickle of aid. This is the only way they get water and food, overwhelmingly. And Israel shut that down over the last couple of days. Israel sent tanks to the Rafah crossing with Egypt, and they, on their own, shut down the Kerem Shalom crossing. This means the trickle of food, water, and medical aid is not getting in. Then Israel threatened 110,000 people that the area they were living in was going to be hit with extreme force and they needed to evacuate within hours. These are starving people. These are people who do not have modes of transportation. These are ill people. These are infirm people. These are children and elderly people. And they are being told to go to a place, 110,000 people, to go to a place that Western news agencies are reporting has no space and no water. That's a death march. That's a death march to a death camp. And it's going on right now. And the bombing, the massive bombing that's going on in Rafah is creating a climate of terror. People know that they won't be getting the daily rations of water and food coming in. So the panic that's been set off is so widespread that even people who are not in the zone that Israel told them they had to flee out of are also fleeing. So this is hell on earth. This is the red line has been crossed. Humanity cannot stand still for this. That's the short story.
Alan, that's just like incredible. And this situation, to be very clear to our audience, that the munitions that are being dropped, the bombs that are falling on the people of Gaza, are bombs that are being provided by the United States. Intelligence is provided by the United States. This is on us as well as on the state of Israel. And this requires a ferocious response from the people in this country that has to build on what the students have been doing. And really, the students themselves, it's a big subject of our show today, we're going to get into that, have been sort of manning the barricades of conscience on this. But what I'd like you to bring out some more, Alan, is what is the overall situation in the rest of Gaza as this invasion of Rafah is going on?
Well, that's a good question. Given what I just sketched out, many people are making a call that rather than go to the so-called humanitarian zone, they will try to return to central and north Gaza, meaning Khan Yunis, the largest city in the center, and then further north to Gaza City, which, without getting into it, was even under a brutal Israeli siege, a city of 1 million people, hospitals, universities, mosques, community centers, 1 million human beings basically reduced to rubble. And Khan Yunis, pretty much the same thing. And yet, under the desperate conditions, many people are taking their chances to go back to these places. And they are places where Israel has relatively even more freedom to carry out massacres. People who follow the coverage at Revcom may remember that an Israeli supervised food distribution, supposedly in Gaza City about a month ago, ended up with Israel shooting down and killing over 100 people lining up for food. So without the intervention of humanitarian groups, without any kind of media spotlight, Israel has even more freedom in these northern cities and has left them in rubble. And yet this is where people are fleeing to. So that's the short story. It's a horror, it's a heartbreak, and that's the situation.
Finally, Alan, what is the situation in the West Bank as this is going down in Gaza?
Yeah, last week when I was on the show, I used the example of a very typical situation where, first of all, a pogrom of rabid, racist, violent, so-called settlers, really a lynch mob, comparable, if you know American history, to a Ku Klux Klan assault on a black community in the Jim Crow South, descends on a Palestinian town within the West Bank, a section of historic Palestine that's occupied by Israel illegally through war. And this mob of settlers burns houses, terrorizes people, kills people. Then the Israeli army comes in. And what do? In the particular example I gave last week, the first two things they went after were the town bakery and the town sewage system. Well, if you're going after Hamas or Islamic fundamentalist terrorists operating in small cells, engaging in small scale shootouts with Israel on a low level, that's not what you do. If you are trying to drive the Palestinian people living in the West Bank, that is the area to the west of the Jordan River, in historic Palestine, to crush them, to drive them out. In our coverage at RevCom, we quoted a woman who was told that her house has been destroyed. She has to leave her town, and said there is no place safe in the West Bank for Palestinians. So these are the kinds of conditions that people are facing. The escalated genocidal ethnic cleansing going on in the West Bank is going hand in hand with what's going on in Gaza.
All right, Alan. This is a situation of just unprecedented terror, horror, man-made famine. It is a genocide, and it is a genocide that is in the interest of U.S. imperialism, and they have been continuing this. And whatever maneuvers you hear, even within the ruling class here, their differences are over how rapidly to crush the Palestinian people. And this is something that people need to stand up against in even greater numbers than they have thus far. So thank you, Alan, for being on the show again and for the coverage on RevCom.us. And we'll probably see you, if not next week, the week after, but we're going to keep having you on the show to update our audience.
Okay, thanks.